Thanks so much for coming out tonight. I'm glad to introduce Bill Hoefflin, who is the Senior Naturalist at Wood County Parks. We do have a connection. I'm the program coordinator at Wood County Parks. So we work together, and Bill is a lifelong resident of Eastern Lucas County. Began his life in the Nickel. If you didn't get that reference, you can ask him later after the program. But he's been a naturalist since 2004. And has worked at places including Metroparks, Toledo Nature's Nursery, Maumee Bay State Park, and he started at Wood County Parks in 2017. Yes, 2017. Thank you. And yes, also enjoys hunting, fishing, woodworking, spending time with family, going out catching walleye on Lake Erie, and yeah, doing stuff at the county parks. Yes. So I will turn it over to Bill. He's very knowledgeable about the Great Black Swamp, and he's going to be talking today about the Great Black Swamp, some history, and yeah, lots of things to know about our local natural history. So thanks so much for being here, Bill.
Tonight, I'm here to talk a little bit about the history of the Great Black Swamp. And it's something that I grew up with growing up in East Toledo in Oregon. It's in the culture's memory. The Great Black Swamp was this huge wetland and was a very miserable place to try to make an existence. And it seems to have stuck culturally. Today, if you talk to a ditch commission or drainage manager and try to get them to do anything other than rush water to the lakes and rivers, they get very vehement that no, we need to get the water gone. So that's stuck around even longer than such cultural things as the flu epidemic of 1918. People didn't keep that in their memory as long as they've kept the memory of the Great Black Swamp alive. So let's see here. Mouse have to do mouse. Oh, I see. All right. So yeah, history of the Great Black Swamp. That's today's date. That's my name. I'm breaking this down into 4 stories. And I put the approximate years there. But the story of the swamp does begin long ago, prehistory even. And it revolves around what made these marks. Let's do some audience participation. What made these marks? Glaciers. Okay. Now a little bit harder question. This is a local metro park that you can see these glacial striations at. Which one? What's that? Nope. Blue Creek. So this is on the northeast corner of the quarry pond near the hog barn in the flight cage of Nature's Nursery. That's where these glacial striations are. So these are available to go look at any time that the park's open. There are other striations elsewhere on the Blue Creek property, including the upper overflow parking lot for the soccer fields. So they let people park vehicles that leak oil and other fluids on top of glacial striations. So it's always good to try to protect our resources. And I'm going to leave it at that. But what the glacier was, Earth has gone through periods of glaciation, but the most recent one was the Laurentide ice sheet coming down onto Canada and basically plowing through the Great Lakes repeatedly. It would grow, melt, and we call melting retreating, and then grow again over thousands of years. And there's a distinct pattern to it. So ice ages come and go, and they're a natural part of our climate cycle. There's various drivers that drive ice ages, but what they do for us here in the temperate zones is that they plow away old, worn out soil, and they deposit material for new soils that are more fertile and better at growing plants and sustaining ecosystems. So if we come a little bit closer to present, one of the things that people are always interested in, especially kids, are the Ice Age animals that were here. And they were here in Northwest Ohio when Northwest Ohio wasn't covered with a sheet of ice. These animals, we've found fossils throughout Ohio, especially the Seneca Caverns here in Northwest Ohio. These are animals that are over 97 pounds. And they include the mastodon, the mammoth. Mastodons were more of our shrub and forest megafauna, and the mammoths were more of the dry steppe, the more herbaceous habitats. And you see a little skull there for scale. That's a skull that was found in Alaska years ago. Big, big animals. One of those Ice Age animals, the first evidence was found and described by science from a specimen right here in Ohio, and that's the giant beaver. Take your regular beaver and multiply it by about 3.5, and you get the giant beaver. These guys were not dam builders like our modern beaver, but they had a similar body shape and morphology, and they were also herbivores. They were just in larger bodies of water that they could cruise for vegetation. A couple of the others, that upper left is the stag moose, bottom left is the peccary, which is one of the most common fossil remains found in Ohio. Wild horses, upper right, and then one of my favorites, which is the ground sloth in the bottom right. Between the ground sloth and the mammoth and the mastodon, those animals were responsible for some of the woody species that we see that have huge seeds or fruits. So if you've run into a Kentucky coffee tree or a honey locust tree or Osage orange, pawpaw, those plants co-evolved with these super large herbivores. And the reasons their fruits are so big is that they were attractive to these big animals who would bite them once or twice, swallow the rest, and most of the seeds would pass right through the system and be deposited as you know what, somewhere else in the environment. When these mega herbivores went extinct, those species of plants that were adapted to them started to decline. And Osage orange actually retreated all the way back to Texas, to the Red River Valley. Was the only place it was found pre-settlement. The Native Americans propagated it on purpose because Osage orange wood makes such great bows. They would trade wood with other natives. They would not trade seeds or plants. They kept a monopoly on it. If you're a fan of Game of Thrones, you've heard of dire wolves. They were a real thing. Fossilized records of them do occur from Ohio. There's a pack of dire wolves attacking a giant, I think it's a musk ox in this picture. But dire wolves are about a third bigger than our modern wolves, and they weren't as much of an endurance predator as we think of wolves. Wolves we think of as running down prey to the point of exhaustion. These guys were more of a pack and ambush type animal. And then every little boy's favorite animal after he's learned all the dinosaurs is the saber-toothed cat. I learned it as the saber-toothed tiger, but they're actually closer related to lions than tigers. So saber-toothed cat's what we talk, or how we name them nowadays. Another ambush predator would lie in wait. Those long fangs were meant to pierce throats, jugular, the trachea, the windpipe, to cause massive damage to those parts of their prey. They were actually pretty relatively fragile teeth. They could be broken off if there was enough side force loaded onto them. So a lot of fossils have saber-toothed cats with broken canines. So what happened to all these wonderful large animals? we don't know for sure. It's still debated, and there's still research being done. One of the leading theories is a very quick change in climate after the warm up to another cold spell. Now, we talk about here in our modern human history, the little ice age that happened in the 1900s and how much havoc that wrought across the northern hemisphere. And you can see the little blip there. Number 10 is the little ice age. If you look at number 5, that's the beginning of the younger Dryas, which is a big change in global temperature. There's thought that it was caused by a lot of meltwater from glaciers, both in Canada and Greenland, and possibly even the loss of ice-dammed lakes that would make Lake Erie look tiny. And all this water rushed either to the Arctic Ocean or to the northern Atlantic and shut down the flow of heat from the Gulf of Mexico that went that way. But there's also evidence pointing that these megafauna went extinct about 1,000 years before the younger Dryas. So there is no definitive answer as of right now. It's not settled science at all. So as far as the glaciers and their effect here in Northwest Ohio, we're looking at the last age, the Wisconsin age glaciers, and Lake Maumee, famous for being the largest of the pro-glacial lakes. Those are the lakes that would become Lake Erie. The thing with lakes is that they collect water, right? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
A lot of response here. I've been talking too much. You guys have already gotten quiet. I will try to do some more interaction. So they're collecting meltwater for the most part, but water always runs downhill. So water's running in from all sides to this pro-glacial lake. And when water runs across land, it picks up what? Sediment, and it carries it. And once it reaches still water, that sand drops out really fast. And along the edges of the lake, what do you get? A wonderful beach. I grew up going to Crane Creek State Park, which was a natural beach, and you can no longer swim there. They replaced it with Maumee Bay State Park, which that lake beach is just kitty litter. But the sand drops out right near shore. If it's carried by rivers, it might go out a little bit further. But what's carried out into the lake itself is silt that drops out relatively quickly, but then the clay particles, those are carried for miles, and they take hours or days to settle to the bottom. So you start getting these deposits of sand along the water's edge and clay along the lake bottom. And it happens over and over again. So Lake Maumee 2 was a thing, but most of the records from Lake Maumee 2 were the shoreline records, rather the sand deposits, were sort of disturbed and eroded by Maumee 3, which was just a little higher than 2. But we're starting to leave deposits that are going to form some very interesting structures as far as the landforms here in Northwest Ohio. So if we see this shoreline right here, just keep that shape in mind. That shoreline is impacted by big mounds of sediments that were left behind when the glacier stopped advancing. Glaciers act like these bulldozers pushing sediment and rocks and other material in front of them. When they stop and retreat, all that material is left behind. So these lake shapes are influenced mostly by those, we call moraines, end moraines. That won't do anything. That's just my point. Probably it's one of the terminal moraines from one of the earlier glaciations. Yeah. So, Whittlesey, another one. This one I think is, I believe, named after a geologist that described it or described some part of all of this. But another beach ridge left behind. And then Warren is one of my personal favorites because it's responsible for most of the sediment deposited in Wood County that's not clay. So, you know, you're always interested in things that are a little bit more rare. You give them a little bit more weight, maybe. We have a couple sand ridges running through Wood County that were left behind by Glacial Lake Warren. So we're going to be talking about that a little bit more. But this gives you sort of the idea of the level of the lake as time went on. You see Maumee is the highest, and then Maumee 2, a little bit lower, and then 3, 4. Then Arkona, Whittlesey, Warren. We don't talk much about Wayne or Grassmere or Lundy. They're relatively short-lived, didn't leave behind a lot of deposits. Regardless, during Maumee 1, if you were sitting here while it existed, you'd be at the bottom of at least 70 feet of water. So how far away are you from the Laurentide ice sheet right now? You are 1,972 miles away from the last of the Laurentide ice sheet. It does still exist. There's a remnant on Baffin Island in Canada. So it's not totally gone, but with the climate change that is predicted, it's estimated that it will be gone in about 300 years. And that's if we do something about climate change. If we don't do anything about it, it could be less than or around 200 years. So it does exist. So story 2, a lot shorter time frame, but this is what you consider as the height of the swamp. You know, this is the swamp that is most intact. So most of us have probably seen the picture on the right. It pops up on internet searches everywhere if you ever search for a Great Black Swamp. I don't know the source material for it. I don't know how accurate it is, but we can do a little bit of, sussing out where they got this from. The image on the right is elevation provided by satellite. And you can see the moraines that are labeled there, the Defiance, Fort Wayne, Wabash. Those were all left over by glaciers dropping material at their bases. And that's what really constrained the Great Black Swamp. Now, these are 2 separate images, and it did take a little bit of finagling, but if you overlay them, you can start to see what determined the shape of the Great Black Swamp. So. We're talking about beach deposits. I like maps. I like old maps. They're cool. In the green are the Lake Warren deposits. Could make the joke that everyone makes. Toledo Express Airport somewhere right around here. Really? Nothing. That's like the joke at the Oak Openings Forum. Here's the airport. Come on. All right. All right. So here's Bowling Green to give you a landmark. Sand Ridge is running right through here in our county, the county I work for, I should say. We have a lot of the Oak Openings deposits over here from Maumee and Whittlesey. And this diagram came from, I'm going to brain fart really hard. It was a BGSU professor, Jane Forsyth. Yeah. Yes. So these are old maps, and there's newer science that probably have more accurate maps. You can't find them on Google. They're stuffed into scientific papers that are behind paywalls because I don't work for an educational institution that pays for journals, which is fine. It's fine. It's fine. Love it when we hide science behind making money. This is something I found recently. It's the original vegetation of Ohio, put together by Robert Gordon at the Ohio State University. And his source material were the land surveyor journals for the surveyors that basically plotted our entire state, assuming you're a Michigan or an Ohio resident. If you're a Michigan resident, I don't know what to tell you. But it's not great resolution. Up in the upper right, I do have a zoom in of Fulton and Lucas and Wood. And the key that I want to make mention of is that Wood County was home to as much, if not more, prairie than Lucas County. Lucas County had a mix of wet and dry prairies. Wood County, for the most part, was thought to have wet prairies. So pretty big complex in our county. And they surrounded a lot of Bowling Green. That's why Bowling Green was about the first town inside the boundaries of the Great Black Swamp. The entire town sits higher and drier than everywhere else in that area. But if you're looking at this map and you're like, well, I know this is the Oak Openings. That's Oak Savannah. All right, it's a band that runs through Lucas County back into Henry. There was a tiny little Oak Savannah west of Bowling Green near Weston, Ohio as well. And it just so happens one of our parks is right on the edge of that or was inside of it. And that's Baldwin Preserve. And I've walked through most of Baldwin Preserve because it's one of the parks that we allow hunting. And I have deer hunted there a couple times. Most of it is very damp, but it does have a nice sand ridge running through it. And the farm field on the edge of it to the north, after the farmer plows, you can see every hump of sandy soil in that entire field. And it's just a patchwork. It's quite interesting. So in the distant past, that might have been a really interesting oak savanna or upland oak woods right there. This is a map put together by a researcher at the University of Toledo. I don't think I can read it off of here right now. But these were the prairies that were found in Wood County prior to wide-scale draining of the swamp. And they're pretty extensive. Oh, that reminds me. I wanted to read a passage. So, great local author, Jim Mollenkampf, wrote a series of 3 books of stories of the Great Black Swamp. I don't know that it's in print anymore, that you can go get one. But if you're on a used book site, you might be able to find one. This is Stories of the Great Black Swamp 2, the 2nd edition. So maybe not quite as juicy of stories as book 1. But so this is just a little excerpt from a guy named Thomas Tracy from 1837. And let's see here. The next morning, they came across a particularly deep hole where one horse of my team fell and went so completely under that only the top of his head and a strip along his back was visible, Tracy recalled. They pulled through that stretch and made it to Woodville around midday. There they left the Maumee and Western Reserve Road, traveling now on a trail along the Portage River to Forks of Portage. Any guesses what town that is today? Hemberville. Good job. I had to look it up. Where they spent the night. They made fairly good progress the next day until it was time to leave the Portage River Trail and head due west across the open marsh towards the sand ridges that were destined to become the city of Bowling Green. There they encountered a veritable lake, Tracy recalled. The water was about a foot deep and the grass, now the 23rd of May, about a foot out of the water. A sea of living, moving green, beautifully undulating in the light breeze, glistening in the sunlight, and always indicating that just a few rods ahead, we should make solid ground. An illusion that held good the entire distance to the foot of the ridges. So he's describing one of these prairies. Basically, from here, here's the Forks to Bowling Green. So even though just this little part's labeled as prairie, chances are that most of that distance was.
What year did you say that was?
This was 1837. Yeah. So we haven't talked about all the stats of it, and I'm going to, because there is one thing that keeps hanging out in the collective story of the swamp that needs correcting. The swamp was roughly 140 miles long and averaged between 20 and 40 miles wide. It stretched from Fort Wayne to the shores of Lake Erie, from the mouth of the Maumee almost to Sandusky, Ohio. It covered 1,500 square miles. It's about 1 million acres. It was a third of the size of Connecticut. A third. It was not the size of Connecticut. That is a little factoid that's been lodged in my brain for 15 years, and I've been trying to correct it for the last 6 years. After I actually took the time to look it up. Connecticut has 4,500 square miles of land. The swamp was 1,500 square miles. I did find a very old mention of that stat of it being the same size as Connecticut. It was in the Toledo Blade from the 90s. And it was said by a naturalist that I have very much respect for and will not name.
Maybe they meant Rhode Island.
Yes, so the Great Black Swamp was just a little bit bigger than the land area of Rhode Island. So it would, if it was its own state, it would have been the second smallest. So we talk about the oak openings, and it is directly tied to the same event that formed the Great Black Swamp. And ecologically, they are tied together. Animals move between the oak openings region and the Great Black Swamp. It was a dichotomous relationship. About all I have to say on that slide. So where does that get us to in our story? In story number 2, all of this stuff. It revolves around soil. The way you make a swamp is through water and soil. And so Northwest Ohio got a fresh start. Everything here is less than 20,000 years old, except for the rock underneath the soil. And the few little glacial erratics that got left behind scattered all over our area. The big rock that's out by the open air shelter was such a glacial erratic. It was not deposited here. It was put here, dropped here. And it was always a fun little experiment to have groups of kids try to move it, which is a futile activity for them, but it was fun to watch. Lake Erie and the pro-glacial lakes are what gave us the Great Black Swamp. That clay soil that was laid along the bottom of all those pro-glacial lakes created a very flat, non-sloping landmass with particles of soil that don't like to let water drain through them. And that's your recipe for the Great Black Swamp. This is how the state categorizes our soils. You can see 7 is the Maumee Lake Plain. 7.2 is your oak openings, or slightly higher in grade. It's a Maumee sand plain, sorry. We do have one running from Henry to Wood. That's that glacial Lake Warren leftover. We have very shallow soils with bedrock, limestone bedrock right underneath in here. But all of this is basically tied to Great Black Swamp or those pro-glacial lakes. When you get to the green color, now you're outside of the influence of those lakes. 7.5, by the way, is the Defiance Moraine. That's what's showing there. So who is here first? Who was here first? Native people. And the Great Black Swamp wasn't typically inhabited by natives inside the swamp. They were along the periphery, along the larger rivers on the bluffs that actually drained. They weren't even here year round until they were sort of forced to be by Europeans. They would migrate north in the spring, build summer camps. They would farm, they'd fish, they'd hunt, gather their food, head back south. They could do this sort of migrating thing. And if they used up an area or wasn't productive, the next year they'd come back and choose a new area. We tend to romanticize natives as not being exploitive or doing things in balance. The balance was mostly that their populations were small. And if they wore out an area, they just pick a new area. Not to say they didn't waste things. Their reputation is, using everything and being wise isn't valid. But they would move on to new areas if they used everything in a certain area previously. So, big thing with this drawing, this is artwork depicting natives near the Great Black Swamp. They were up here in the summer. Why do you need fires in the summer? Mosquitoes, right? Europeans or Americans picked up on that pretty quick. If you smoke out your living space, you keep the mosquitoes out. The trade-off is you're breathing wood smoke, basically all the time you're inside. So what did the swamp look like? We've already been talking about, it was big. No, we haven't been talking about it. It was dark. The trees that were there in that ecosystem, that was a climax ecosystem that's been pretty much undisturbed and growing for over 9,000 years. So they end up with this old growth forest with tree trunks, including one that was measured in Wood County, of 45 feet in circumference. A tree that had a 14-foot thick trunk when it was cut down. It got the name Great Black Swamp because the water was black, the soil was black. If you walked in at noontime in the summer, the canopies of trees were so thick that it looked like sunset. And then add in the clouds of biting and stinging insects that also looked black. If you've ever walked here or at Pearson in July of a wet summer, you know how bad the mosquitoes can get. You stop for just a second and there's 50 of them on your arm. It's no fun. And overall, that swamp was about 80 to 90% swamp forest. The remainder of it were the prairies. And they were sunny and open and a little bit drier. And comparatively speaking, they were paradise. They were beautiful. Prairie is one of the most beautiful habitats that we have here in Northwest Ohio. Today, where can I send you to see the Great Black Swamp? Where do you guys send people? It looks a little bit like out here. Yeah, this is a picture from, this might be from Pearson. It's an old photo. The answer is there's not a great place to send them to see an intact portion of the Great Black Swamp. In my research, a lot of researchers from outside of this area are astounded that something that was 1,500 square miles doesn't even have 1 square mile of intact example of it left. That's how hated the swamp was. Every bit was destroyed or altered. The big one people say to go to is Gull Woods. But if you look at a map of the Great Black Swamp and you look at where Gull Woods is, technically it's not in what is considered the Great Black Swamp. That brings us to story 3, the sad chapter. So the natives that were here, it was a mix. The Algonquin Nation was generally the dominant one here in Northwest Ohio. The Iroquois were here periodically because they had trapped all the beaver out of their own territory and started moving into Ohio, into the Algonquin nations to harvest their beaver. And it led to the Beaver Wars, which I'm not a great expert on, but it was a thing. But you can see there's not really many tribes labeled around Northwest Ohio. And it brings us to our easy to digest idea of what happened to our state and what happened to the Great Black Swamp. So this is a poster that was put out shortly after Ohio's bicentennial by Division of Wildlife. And it shows what Ohio looked like pre-settlement, pre-statehood, I should say. Ohio in 1803 was about 95% forest. There's about 4% prairie and 1% water. The light aqua you see there, that represents the Great Black Swamp. We had some pretty cool animals roaming around Ohio. All of these. So mountain lions, which are cool animals, but I also would not want them to be my neighbor. This is an animal that can get up to 200 pounds and is fully capable of taking down the animal on the far right, which is an elk. Elks can weigh up to 800 pounds. Mountain lions in our state typically were called cougars or pumas or panthers, since we don't really have mountains in our state. Anyone know another name for mountain lions? Catamount. See, that's the one that kids never know. I test them on that one. So we had all these critters. If you're unfamiliar, Fisher and Martin, we're familiar with black bear, bobcat, gray wolf, porcupine, and eastern woodland bison. These were all found in Ohio when Ohio became a state. Oops, rolly ball. There we go. One more cool map. I know it's not showing up super well to you guys. It doesn't get big enough, but this little ridge right here, this cartographer or map maker did notice the Defiance Moraine. That's what's represented here. You don't see any other hills until you get to southern Ohio. So that one must have really stuck with them. So this is a map from, I think Library of Congress has a copy of this. And it had some cool things like the Tiffin River was called the Bean River. And the Ottawa River actually has a different name as well. And I can't remember it off the top of my head. But like I said, I like old maps. That's probably the last map in the program. So eventually, claims were set and settled in the rest of Ohio, and people turned their eyes to the northwest corner. It was a mix. We had waves of immigrants coming to the United States at that point in our history. A lot of Germans and Irish, and they knew how to farm, and they had an idea of how to drain land. The first step was clearing the land, removing the trees. Unfortunately, there were no roads, there was no infrastructure to get most of the wood out. A lot of it was either buried, thrown in deep parts of the swamp. Some of it was milled and used locally to build buildings, but the majority of it was burned. So trees that were anywhere from 300 to 600 years old, just being burned. Old growth, lots of growth rings, narrow grain, wood that would go for thousands of dollars today. At first, it was disorganized. It is not uncommon for a person to get a plot of land for pennies per acre and get there, clear the trees, and then start draining the land just wherever they felt like draining it to, whatever was easiest. And then they'd have a new neighbor move in. They'd clear the trees and they'd just drain the land, sometimes right back onto the first guy's land. It created a lot of conflicts and more than one altercation. Eventually, someone petitioned the state to make up a system, create a system to do the organized draining of the swamp. And that was in 1859. And I want you to remember that because at this point, 1859, it's thought that less than half the swamp had been cleared and drained. Less than 500,000 acres. People did start noticing that wildlife was disappearing. One of the first ways to help preserve wildlife, the Ohio Fish Commission, which would later become the Division of Wildlife, was created in 1873. Slightly after that, we have the creation of this monstrosity, which actually was a really interesting feat of engineering. This thing, does anyone know the name for it? It's a tiling machine. It has a certain name. The Buckeye Traction Ditcher, sometimes called the Buckeye Traction or Steam Traction Ditcher. It was fired originally with a steam engine or boiler, but the wheel on the back is your trencher. And the way it was designed, it could dig down about 7/8 of its own diameter. Notice there's no spokes in the center that are being driven from a central sprocket. It was driven from over here. And this machine allowed a team of 3 or 4 to triple the amount of work, amount of ditch or trenches and pipes laid as a crew of 15 used to do. So more than a 5-fold increase in productivity. If you ever want to see one, there is one on display at the Hancock Historic Society down in Findlay. The patent for this came through in 1894. James B. Hill was originally born in Fremont and moved to Bowling Green and saw how inefficient just human effort at tiling fields was and invented this machine. So it was invented here in Northwest Ohio. Ultimately, it was shipped also down to the Everglades to help drain big chunks of the Everglades, and it was shipped across the world to places to drain other wetlands. Today, Ohio has drained 90% of their historic wetland acreage. The only state that's done more than us or worse than us is California. They've done 91%. So you can see the guy at the back sitting in the trench. Even though that was mechanical and helpful, the other things that were here in Northwest Ohio still made life miserable. Malaria was brought to the United States in the 1600s with some of the first colonists, and it never left. They took it with them everywhere they went. And malaria in the swamp was rampant. It's called swamp fever. And you'd have it, you'd be miserable, and then it would fade away. And you waited. If it came back after 2 days, it wasn't bad. Came back after 3 days, it was going to be bad. If it came back after 4 days, it was going to be horrible. It involved something with the incubation period of the malaria bacteria. It was said that when families were struck down, you could walk by and hear the cabin shaking from the chills of the bodies inside. And there were whole families that ended up passing away due to the disease. Cholera was also rampant due to poor sanitation. That issue wouldn't be completely solved until the 1910s. There were still cholera outbreaks in East Toledo in the 1910s. Some industrious soul figured out that if you cut down the trees and turn them into firewood and you dig below the topsoil, you hit clay. And the clay was suitable for making clay tile. And very quickly, over 50 tile factories popped up throughout what used to be the Great Black Swamp. And to this day, farmers retile their fields about every 20 years. And if you would dig up all the modern plastic tile, all the old clay tile that's still is there, and stacked it end to end, it would reach past the moon in the area that used to be the Great Black Swamp. Our little section of Northwest Ohio has more tile per square mile than any other place on earth, all to keep the swamp from coming back. Roads were slow to develop. They did eventually get developed after the ditch law passed. As ditches were being dug, the cut was taken and thrown up and made into a road top. And once quarries got online, it was graveled. But at one point, the first road through the swamp was considered the worst road in the entire country. And that was from Lower Sandusky, or as we know it today, Fremont to Perrysburg. It was 30 miles long and had 31 inns, because the average distance you could make in a day in bad conditions was 1 mile per day. Sometimes you'd make it halfway to the next one and your team would get stuck, your horses and cart. And you just go back to the previous hotel and stay another night, and then hire the hotel owner's oxen to pull your stuff out the next day.
Route 20 pretty much follow that?
Yes, Route 20 is the old Maumee Western Reserve Road, the worst road in the country. And there are somewhere between 2 and 4 mile markers, because there's a mile marker every mile. Though some of the landowners have put out replicas, not originals. Okay, so by 1881, we had lost all those animals that we talked about at the beginning of this time period. They're gone from our state. Mostly through habitat loss. You know, if you don't have a place to live, you can't live there. But a lot of the predators were also persecuted very extensively. There were no game laws. You could shoot as much as you wanted, whenever you wanted. And predators went pretty early. The earliest to be gone, though, was actually the woodland bison. It was gone the same year Ohio became a state. It was competing for food in some of the first areas that returned into farmland, the drier prairies. So you wouldn't want a 2,000-pound buffalo eating your crops that you need to feed your family and your farm animals. Wolves and cougars were gone very quickly because they would attack livestock. What probably drove the last nail in the coffin was the oil boom in the late 1880s. 1884, oil was found near Findlay, Ohio, and it started a modern oil boom here in Northwest Ohio and fueled a lot more people coming to work in the oil fields, a lot more housing being needed, a lot more food needed. And it rounds out the end of our story, which was 1886, which is the date that is the year that most people consider the end of the Great Black Swamp. So we started with the ditch law in 1859, at about half the swamp remaining, and by 1886, it was gone. So less than 30 years, we got rid of 500,000 acres of swamp. That's how industrious humans can be. And that brings us to our last story, which is a mixed bag. So this is what Ohio looked in 1803, that 95% of forest. Blank slide for whatever reason. By 1903, we were down to about 17%. You can see the Great Black Swamp's gone. It's nothing but a memory, but quite a memory that still sticks with people today. As we mentioned with the ditch commissions. Lot less biodiversity. We weren't done losing species in Ohio yet. Does anyone recognize the top left? Passenger pigeon. Anyone? Let's see, bonus points. When did the last passenger pigeon in captivity pass away? 1914. Very good. Martha, the passenger pigeon, spent the remainder of her days at the Cincinnati Zoo. She was taxidermied and she belongs to the Smithsonian now. So periodically she is on display. I don't know if she's on constant display.
That was the last Carolina parakeet too, wasn't it?
I don't know. Was that 1904 or 1914? I feel like the parakeet might have been earlier. It might be. It might be. So river otter, wild turkey, white-tailed deer, the bottom two we don't think of as being rare in the slightest anymore. But they were gone by 1914. Or yeah, all three were gone by 1914. The deer and turkey were thought to be gone by 1909 from our state. They weren't extinct. They're certainly gone from our state. Who's this friendly fellow? He's usually supplied by the Acme company. God, it's a tough crowd, Jim. Super tough crowd. This is a coyote. Are these native to Ohio? No, they're not. First one was spotted in 1919, just outside of Cincinnati, Ohio. They've been in our state just over 100 years now. And they're sort of filling that niche of some of our predators that we're missing, but they can only accommodate, the medium prey. These guys are not capable of taking down a healthy deer on their own in most situations. So we did start trying to preserve and protect and bring back wildlife. My employer started in 1934. You can see Metroparks beat us by about 4 years. That's fine. State Forest beat them by 6 years. And the first state park land was Buckeye Lake, and that was 1896. Buckeye Lake was a former feeder lake for the canal system. And the canal system didn't last long. It was quickly outstripped by the railroad system. By the 1940s, deer were back in our state. The first deer hunting season was, I think, 46. It was open in 3 counties and 126 bucks were harvested. Today, on average, 200,000 deer are harvested every year in Ohio. And that's a steady number. So they can replace over 200,000 members every year. Wild turkeys were a little bit more difficult. They tried bringing in baby wild turkeys and releasing them. They all died because turkeys are stupid. What they ended up doing is capturing adults from the Ozark Mountains and transplanting them into Ohio. And they did that a few times for the first 5 or so years. And they did well enough in Ohio that then they started capturing Ohio turkeys and moving them elsewhere in the state. So they've sort of spread out from southeast and eastern Ohio. And they're back in big numbers in Lucas County. We see them in Wood County. One of the wildlife biologists who's been very prescient about things, he was the one that warned that Canada geese were going to be a nuisance someday before they were, and they were. He warned that otter were going to be a nuisance someday before they were, and they are in certain places. He has warned that wild turkey is our next big nuisance animal. Biggest advice I can give to you, never feed them where they can see you putting down the food because they become habituated. And this is a big bird that can be up to 20-some pounds and can be very fierce and intimidating when it wants its food, and it will go after you. If you ever want to see that, YouTube's got lots of fun videos. There's a poor postal worker in Connecticut, I think it is, or New England, that gets chased every day on his route by wild turkeys in a neighborhood. So, good parts of our story. I would guess most of the people in this room were around for the first Earth Day. What year was it? 1970, August 22. Earth Day's coming up in 2 days. There was a big push to protect wildlife. They came in the 20s and 30s. Theodore Roosevelt, John Muir, other environmentalists, they sort of got the ball rolling. And then, World War I hits, the Depression hits, World War II hits, and then we have the huge post-war industrial boom, where it's a new period of expansion and altering environments, and we start to see the effects. We see the water pollution, the air pollution, the wildlife that's on the verge of going extinct, and it starts a new revolution, new environmental revolution in the 70s. And we get the Earth Day, we get the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and we as a society, not necessarily this group, I wouldn't expect this group, but as society, we've sort of been coasting on that for 50 years. And we can't coast anymore. Time is running out, both locally to take care of the nutrient problem that affects Lake Erie and globally to take care of our climate. So we're starting to see that pick back up, which is good. We could use a new campaign and more momentum. River otters were reintroduced in 1986 here in Ohio. That was one of the more recent success stories. And 123 individuals were released into 4 watersheds in Northeast Ohio, and they've since moved all across almost the entire state. They are back in the Maumee River. They're back in the Portage River. Has anyone seen one in the wild here yet? Best advice, Providence Metropark along the canal after a snowfall. Start looking for otter slides. Okay. And if you're friendly with the maintenance staff or the park rangers, they might have a little tip of where you can go see one. Our friend the black bear is also back in our state. First recorded reproduction was 2 or 3 summers ago. And the population is estimated to be about 125 individuals. When I went to Hocking College in 01, the summer of 02 was the first time a bear had been spotted in Athens County, which is where OEU and Hocking both are. So there is some excitement there. So 1903, Ohio's looking pretty sad. 2003, our bicentennial, we're looking a little bit better. We have some woods there up in the northwest part of the state. It pretty much is the oak openings corridor from Maumee State Forest to the state line. That's pretty much what that's representing right there. State was trying to give some credit to us here in Northwest Ohio. But a lot more animals are back in our state, but it's not the way it was. It's about 33% forest, 35. There's a lot of row crops, a lot of development, and a big change in the animal populations. We talked about coyote, but other increases we saw or see today, the cute little raccoons, which if you're a fan of egg-laying reptiles, you're not a fan of raccoons, so don't count me as a fan. At one point, Ohio had a bounty on squirrels because they were decimating farmers' crops. Part of your annual income tax was to turn in a certain number of skulls to your county seat. Most of us have seen the little bunnies in our yards. They are more numerous, as is the muskrat, and the predator of the muskrat, which is the mink in the top right corner, and possums, which I don't have a problem with because they're so awesome. And then red fox, there's debate whether they're native to Ohio or not. Indiana does not consider them a native species. It's thought that red fox moved in from the New England area or Canada into the Midwest after we altered our habitats, got rid of our forests. Our native, or for sure native fox is the gray fox. Ohio considers it a native animal. So take that as you will, I guess. We are actually at Wood County Parks, the USDA APHIS division's setting up a camera trap for gray fox at one of our properties right now to try to track that population because it's not well measured. About the only way fox populations are measured is through trackers and how many foxes they harvest in a trapping season. Question time.
Where and why are the otters possibly becoming a nuisance?
Oh yeah, I sort of glossed over that one. So if you are one of those landowners that dig yourself a nice 1 or 2 acre pond and add the aqua shade and bring in the bass and the bluegill and take it one step further to sort of what I think of as a ridiculous level, but it's an opinion. If you're feeding your bass every day so they get nice and big so your grandkids can come over and land an 8-pounder, if there is a ditch or creek within a half mile of that pond, chances are at some point an otter is going to find that pond. And for an animal as capable as an otter, it is literally shooting fish in a barrel to depopulate your pond of bass. The first complaints rolled in the early 90s in Northeast Ohio, and pond owners were finding largemouth bass heads on their banks. And they're like, what is doing this? Most of us are used to herons taking a good chunk of fish out of ponds. But the thing about herons is they take all the evidence with them. They just follow a hole. And then when they poop it out, you can't recognize it as bass anymore. So this was a new thing that was showing up. And they quickly figured out that it's river otter. So just be aware of that.
So online, we have some folks that had questions.
All right.
Margie Trumbull said, when does the mud hen appear?
So the American coot is our mud hen. It is very frequent in the marshes in the fall, but probably best known in the spring on its migration. And you can find thousands of them in Howard Marsh, McGee Marsh, Metzger's Marsh. The funny thing is it's not a yellow bird at all. It's completely black, unlike the mud hens downtown. I always thought that was funny.
Chuck Pearson said there's a full-size atlas of the vegetation types of Michigan from Surveyor Notes, $100 on Amazon. It overlays.
Is the photo of the ones that handle everything going in and out. They're really good. I'll be right back.
Here too. Very cool. Other questions? Yeah.
Talking about coyotes, I'm sure you're correct that a coyote can take down an adult deer, but are they not significant predators against fawns?
They can be, but coyotes are very smart. They're, all the canines are smart. Fawns are a very short duration food source. You have about 4 to 6 weeks where you can actively find fawns. They need a stable food source year round. They can adapt seasonally, and they're not going to turn down a fawn that they stumble onto. But most of our coyotes are rodent eaters and small mammal eaters because those are available year round. If you have anyone near you that's putting out food for outdoor cats, they're probably feeding coyotes as well. It's funny. The one researcher from Ohio State that's working in Chicago has video of a radio-collared coyote. There's a guy walking a dog down the sidewalk. Coyote goes up next to the car to the front porch, starts eating. The guy's approaching his house. Coyote hears him, leaves. Guy and his dog walk up to the front porch, never noticed anything. The other thing with deer is that for about the first 3 days of their life, the entire time that they can't run, they don't have a scent. And coyotes are a big scent hunter. They rely on eyesight and hearing secondary. And as ridiculous as we see some deer, most of them put their babies in situations where they're not going to be tripped across by a coyote. Canines tend to walk hard edges of things to hunt for food. They don't have the skill or maybe not the brain power to divide up a grassland into grids and do a back and forth search for white-tailed deer. They will just follow either contours or hard edges for the most part. Same reason you find bunny nests in the middle of your lawn. You're like, what are you thinking? She's thinking she only comes back at night and nurses the babies about twice per night, and then she can be gone all day, and no predator, no ground predator is going to find that nest. And if she's not sitting on it, the aerial predators don't find the nest either. So, yeah.
I think it's probably in story 1, but that was when the Maumee River ran from Lake Erie to Fort Wayne, right?
Yes, so the drainage of Lake Maumee was to the southwest, ultimately to the Mississippi watershed. And part of that cut is in the area where the Maumee and the Wabash are close. So the Wabash is Mississippi drainage, Maumee's Lake Erie or Great Lakes drainage. And they were concerned about Asian carp coming through there. And they did install a fence across that spot. And it's been tested once at least where it flooded.
We have a question from Ron Gamble. Considering the glaciers retreating and advancing, how did the prairie vegetation get initially established?
So just like most succession, you have your primary species first. Those are usually your wind or animal dispersed, specifically birds. So wind dispersed plants would show up first. And over time, if the conditions are right, it would stay a prairie. Otherwise, woodies would start invading and it would start moving into shrubs and scrub and then a young forest. I don't know all the various conditions that keep some parts of the Great Black Swamp as prairie. The ones where we have that historic map of Wood County prairies, if you go look at the soil survey for there, it's not because of shallow bedrock and it's not really because of sand deposits. I don't know what exactly is maintaining those as prairies instead of swamp forest. Yeah.
I understand the sturgeon. I didn't realize they were huge in Lake Erie.
Yes.
And they got overfished in maybe the 1880s. And apparently there's an organization that they're trying to restock them now.
Yeah, Toledo Zoo is, along with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and another organization in Michigan. Lake sturgeon, we didn't talk about the lake much. The Maumee River used to run like a tea-stained brown, like the rivers up in the upper, or in Michigan, to Quamanon Falls, that tea color. That's what the Maumee would have looked like naturally, because it wouldn't have been carrying a load of sediment to make it the coffee cream color. And there were in this book, actually, in this one, there's a story of soldiers at Fort Meigs, and they were in need of food, and they literally walked down to the shore of the Maumee with a spear, and they speared over 70 fish in 45 minutes. And some of the spear shots were bringing back multiple fish, northern pike, muskie, buffalo, and a few others. And to speak to the sturgeon, they ran the rivers as well, and the natives would harvest them. And there's a lot of meat, and there were the eggs, very similar to caviar. But when people started commercial fishing Lake Erie, these, up to 8 foot long, 200-pound fish would get into a fishing net and just destroy it, like rip it to shreds getting out. And any sturgeon that they caught, they immediately killed. And after a while, they would build stronger nets with the idea to catch sturgeon. And they would kill them all, haul them back to shore, leave them on the beach to dry up. And then they'd sell them to steamships going up and down Lake Erie to feed their boilers. So a fish that a female has to be 25 to 30 years old to reproduce, you can overharvest them very quickly and deplete them to the point of almost non-existence. But it'll be fascinating to see in the next 20 years if they start coming back up the Maumee River to spawn. That's the goal.
That's gonna take 25 years.
Yeah, you might. So they might start seeing returns from males, because males can breed at about age 15. So hopefully they'll have the instinct and they'll come up the Maumee. They won't find anything to breed with probably, but males will try anything. So the zoo's hoping to see returns. They have they put out certain times of the year, or they're out most of the year, listening devices for the various implanted sensors or transmitters in the fish. All the fish they release get a passive transmitter, a pit tag, like you'd put into a captive reptile, but some of them do have active transmitters, and they're good for at least a year. Yeah, back there.
I had an observation I wanted to share. So a few weeks ago for work, I was out on Mitchell Road. And there was stormwater pipe that they got cracked. The crews were out repairing it.
Yeah.
There were 4 catfish that came out of the stormwater pipe.
Really?
Cut out like that. They weren't real big ones, but they were about that.
They were there.
That big.
Yeah, it's amazing. Dr. Todd Crail at UT has found fish in surprising places locally that you wouldn't think to find them. We've seen trout, rainbow trout at Cedar Creek's preserve, which Cedar Creek drains into Minky Marina West, Anchor Point, there in eastern Lucas County. So these are fish that have traveled from Lake Erie through the marina, up the Cooley Canal, all the way up Cedar Creek's to Cedar Creek's Park in Walbridge, Northwood, whatever you want to call it. Other questions?
In line with that, there's a boy in Reason Lake Township, used to come spearfishing in the creeks. Can't believe we did it. Huge carp.
Yeah.
That's massive. They were every place. And we just took it for granted.
Yeah. Yeah. I did a little bit of bow fishing for carp when I was younger too. It was fun. Good fertilizer. Just bury them in your garden. Yes.
And the Native Americans did that, didn't they, when they planted their plants?
They did, but they used native fish. The carp's from Eastern Europe, and it was introduced in the late 1800s or early 1800s in the Eastern U.S. I don't know how fast it got to Ohio, but Eastern Europeans consider that carp a staple, a food source. So it was brought over with them to provide them sustenance. Last chance. Oh, thank you.
Like Barry said, oh, sorry, yes. To the camera. Yes. Oh, thank you for being here. Like Barry said, our next program will be in August. I think it may be Bill's old supervisor, Dana Bolin, Still gotta get together and figure out that August date. But yes, we'll be back here next in August and join us for all the field trips, the picnics, and all the field trips coming up. So thanks so much for coming out tonight.
There are some